Okay, in the last video, we covered the 1,000-year period from the Torah to the prophets and the writings, and we called that the period of national prophecy. For 1,000 years, from the 40 years in the desert, the 850 years in the land of Israel through the first temple period, down through the exile to the beginning of the second temple period, the first 40 years, we had the gift of prophecy. Over 1 million prophets roamed the land of Israel in our midst during this period, and then it all came to an end. And in the last video, I didn't discuss the reason why it came to an end and the major transition represented in the Jewish people's history. So I want to discuss the reason why it ended and two major innovations that resulted. And to do that, we have to understand the men of the Great Assembly. The men of the Great Assembly was actually the Sanhedrin of the Jewish people. The Sanhedrin is the Supreme Court of the Jewish people. It resided on the Temple Mount. And the reason why they're called the men of the Great Assembly is that many people felt that God didn't exhibit his greatness by letting the temple be destroyed and the Jewish people going into exile. And they saw, in fact, that God's restraining himself from going after our conquerors and allowing the Jewish people to see the temple destroyed and then to experience the pain of exile was a necessary thing. And therefore, just like a parent sometimes has to restrain themselves to allow a child to go through the experiences they need to grow up, so too there was greatness in the fact that we, the Jewish people, had to grow up, so to speak, through the exile experience, and which ultimately enabled us to get back to Israel. So the men of the Great Assembly, this Sanhedrin, is dealing with the Jewish people at the beginning of the Second Temple era. And they have an issue. And to understand this issue, we have to understand a philosophical concept which is central to Torah law. We can divide the ancient world into two philosophical systems. On one hand, you had the Torah system, which was represented by the Jewish people. On the other hand, you had paganism, which was represented by everybody else in the world. Now, the Torah view is that man is made in God's image. That was Abraham's realization, is that each one of us is meant to be godly. And the more godly we become, the more we can relate to our one creator altogether. Paganism more or less looks at the world as gods being made in man's image, meaning that people looked at the world as being ruled by a myriad of different forces, gods, that had all the faults and weaknesses and foibles of humans. They got angry, they were jealous, they were arrogant, they had their temptations, and the job of people was to placate these gods so they could get their bounty. From the Torah point of view, when man is being made in God's image, the worldview is that life is purposeful. We believe that each one of us had a destiny, and the idea was to improve ourselves and to bring out the godliness within us to fulfill a specific purpose. In paganism, the worldview was more or less that life is chaotic, that really it has nothing to do with human beings down below. We're just doing whatever we can to get the most out of the life that we have, and by hopefully pulling the right levers and triggers in order to get the flow of blessing from above. Those are the two different worldviews. Now, a central concept in Judaism is free will, the belief that each one of us is completely free to choose between the desire for good and the temptation for bad, or to aspire for greatness or to become absolutely evil. And therefore, to put a person in the position to be able to make these choices, he has to be equally weighted between good and evil. And therefore, there's got to be what we call free will tension. And the two sides have to be equally slated. Now, in terms of achieving greatness from a Torah point of view, it is prophecy, right? The highest level that a person could achieve is to be able to communicate directly with their Creator, with the Almighty. From a Torah point of view, the absolute evil would be giving into idol worship, is to completely submit yourself to a force that does not exist and to give up the relationship to the Almighty for something which is false and vacuous and superficial and not real. Now, we have a problem, so let's go back to our chart on the 1,000 years of prophecy. The men of the Great Assembly said, look, here we are at the beginning of the Second Temple era. The Jews had seen the first temple destroyed, and they had to go into exile because of the temptation for idolatry. And therefore, here we are coming out of 7 years in Babylon. It was a pagan culture, so the Jews were immersed in a pagan culture. We are weaker. We lost 10 tribes during the first temple period, so we're weaker as a nation. And now we have to rebuild. If the temptation for idolatry exists still, then there's no way we're going to be able to survive successfully during the Second Temple era without giving in again to the temptation of idolatry. And therefore they said, let's take away that drive. So the Talmud tells us that the men of the Great Assembly performed a special service to get rid of the temptation for idol worship. It's hard for us to understand, but it was a type of lust. Just like today people lust after people they've never met before, there was a lust, a temptation, a very strong one, to serve idols. And therefore they performed this special service and they diminished the drive for idol worship. But in order to enable the free will tension, God, as a result, had to remove something on the side of good to equal the balance. And therefore prophecy, that ability to attain prophecy, was lost to the Jewish people. And therefore there was no more temptation for idols, but at the same time the Jewish people lost the ability to attain prophecy. Now we have to appreciate that losing the gift of prophecy was a tremendous blow for the Jewish people, no longer having individuals that could tell us what God wanted from us or what he wanted us to do. Was a tremendous loss of strength for the Jewish people. So the men of the Great Assembly had two major innovations that I think you'll really appreciate understanding now. First, they canonized the books of the prophets and the writings. Like we spoke about in the last video, they chose the prophecies they felt were relevant for the Jewish people for all generations, and they canonized them as our holy texts. So that's number one. And again, if you go back to the last video, you'll understand what those books are more specifically. There's a second innovation which I think you'll really appreciate. Up until the Second Temple period, people pray to God at least once a day in their own words, and that was the mitzvah prayer. The rabbis felt that after the experience of being in exile in Babylon for 70 years, where the dialect was Aramaic and they're exposed to a pagan culture, the Jewish people were going to lose the ability or lost some of their ability, at least for everyone, to pray in a pure Hebrew and with the proper mindset that a Jew would direct themselves and address themselves to God. So what they did was they wrote down for the first time a prayer known as the Amidah. And I want to discuss this right now, but this is a major innovation which takes place right at the beginning of the Second Temple era. The Amidah prayer literally means a standing prayer. In Hebrew, Amidah means standing. That's where we stand with our feet together as we speak to God. It's also known as the silent prayer. Not that it's literally silent, because we have to speak when we pray. Thinking is not prayer. So we speak, but very quietly, so only we can hear ourselves. It's silent to everybody else. It's also known as the Shemona Esrei. In Hebrew, Shemona Esrei means 18, because it was originally composed of 18 various blessings, which we're going to go through. But you're going to see now there's a 19th blessing, because later on in our history, the rabbis felt the need for an additional blessing. So I want to give you a quick overview of this prayer, because this still remains as the centerpiece of every prayer service today throughout the world. So this is the overview. We have these now 19 blessings. The first 3 are blessings of praise, and then the next 13 are various requests, which we're going to go through. And the last 3 are expressions of gratitude. And this is the basic form in general when one addresses the Almighty. You always begin with praise and acknowledging who you're speaking to. Then it's appropriate to make various requests, and of course to conclude with expressions of gratitude for what you've received and for life in general. So that's the format of prayer. These are the 13 requests in a nutshell. The first request is we ask for a good intellect and wisdom, because everything begins in the head. Second, we should repent. We should always come back to God and relate to him as our Father and our King. And then we ask for forgiveness for things we've done wrong. Then we ask for personal redemption to help rid us of personal worries and concerns that are holding us back. 8, we ask for health, good health. 9, for prosperity. The 10th is for the gathering of the exiles from the 4 corners of the world back to Israel. The 11th is then for the restoration of justice, where we can feel we can truly rely on the integrity of the court system. 12 is for the removal of heretics, and this is actually the blessing that was added later in history when many Jews started to have ideas that led to the spawning of other religions. The 13th is for the strength for the righteous, right? If the strongest and the most righteous amongst us are blessed and we're in their midst, then we will be blessed as well and learn from them. 14th for the rebuilding of Jerusalem. The 15th is for the arrival of the Messiah, the descendant of King David. That will be the King of Israel that will establish peace amongst all the nations and restore the Jewish people to their glory. And 16th for the acceptance of our prayers. So that is the Amidah prayer in a nutshell. And what the men of the Great Assembly did by composing this prayer at the point where we're about to lose prophets is it now gave every Jew to stand before the Almighty and speak to the Almighty in a very pure Hebrew, and more importantly, with the perspective of the greatest prophets and judges of Israel. So the needs we were focusing were not on just personal needs, but needs that would affect the entire nation of Israel throughout history. So let's do a little review. So the men of the Great Assembly realized that Jewish people are not going to be able to successfully survive while the temptation for idolatry still exists. The men of the Great Assembly performed a specific ceremony to get rid of the temptation for idolatry, but in order to maintain the free will tension, the Jewish people lost, therefore, the ability to attain the very high level of prophecy. And therefore, the first major innovation was to canonize the writings of the prophets and the writings. If the Jewish people no longer had living prophets in our midst, at least we had the record of what they wrote and the lessons they wanted us to learn throughout our history to guide us for the remainder of our journey. The second innovation was composing the Amidah prayer. It means a standing prayer, or it's also called the silent prayer, the Shemona Esrei. It was originally 18 blessings, it's now 19. The first 3 are various praises, the next 13 are requests, and the last 3 are expressions of gratitude.